Machiavelli once said, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel." I learned this lesson the hard way during my second year at a tech startup in Austin back in 2018. I was the most qualified person on our marketing team, hands down. I had the best analytics background, understood customer psychology better than anyone, and consistently delivered results that beat our KPIs by 30%. But here's what I didn't understand then. None of that mattered because I looked like I was barely out of college. While I was grinding away in my cubicle, wearing wrinkled khakis and old sneakers, my colleague David was showing up in tailored shirts and speaking confidently in meetings. He'd throw around buzzwords like synergistic customer journey optimization that sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing. The crazy part, everyone listened to him. The wake-up call came during our Q3 strategy meeting. I'd spent weeks preparing a comprehensive presentation with real data, showing how we could increase conversion rates by 42%. David presented right after me with a slide deck full of generic stock photos and vague promises about disrupting the marketing paradigm. Guess whose ideas got approved for the bigger budget? David walked away with a $15,000 increase for his innovative thinking, while I got a pat on the back and a keep up the good work. That night, staring at my rejection email, I realized I'd been playing a completely different game than everyone else. The next Monday, I showed up different. I'd spent the weekend shopping for clothes that actually fit, practiced speaking with more authority, and started positioning my ideas as revolutionary insights rather than just, good analysis. I began every recommendation with phrases like, based on cutting-edge consumer behavior research, instead of just diving into the numbers. Within 3 months, I was leading the team meetings. By year end, I'd gotten the promotion that should have been mine from the start. The brutal truth, my actual skills hadn't improved by even 1%, but everyone's perception of my skills had completely transformed. I started noticing this pattern everywhere. The restaurant down the street with mediocre food but Instagram-worthy plating always had a line out the door. My neighbor, who constantly posted about his hustle on LinkedIn, got headhunted for a VP role, even though I knew he spent most afternoons watching Netflix. Meanwhile, genuinely talented people I knew were being overlooked because they couldn't package themselves properly. The most shocking example was my old roommate Jessica. She was brilliant at financial analysis, but terrible at office politics. She'd present her findings by saying things like, "I might be wrong, but maybe we should consider." Her reports were always perfect, but she delivered them like she was apologizing for existing. Her colleague Marcus, on the other hand, would present the exact same type of analysis by saying, "My research clearly indicates that we need to pivot immediately to capture this opportunity." Same data, completely different perception. Guess who got promoted to senior analyst first? I realized that our brains are still running on ancient software. Back when humans lived in tribes, you had maybe 1/10 of a second to decide if a stranger was a threat or an ally. Get it wrong, and you'd end up dead. So our minds evolved to make snap judgments based on visual cues and first impressions, not lengthy evaluations of someone's actual competence. Understanding this changed everything for me. I wasn't being fake or manipulative. I was just learning to speak the language that everyone's subconscious mind already understood. And once you master the art of perception, you realize there's an even more powerful principle at play, one that most people completely miss about timing. Machiavelli warned that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. I discovered what he meant when I almost torpedoed a $20,000 deal because I couldn't read the room properly. This was back in early 2020, right before the pandemic hit. I was working as a sales consultant for a software company in Denver, and I'd been chasing this client for 6 months. The decision maker was Linda Morrison, CFO of a mid-sized logistics company, and she was notoriously tough to pin down. I'd done everything right on paper. My presentation was flawless. The ROI calculations were bulletproof, and our software would genuinely save her company hundreds of hours per month. But every time I tried to close, Linda would give me some variation of, "We need more time to evaluate," or "Let's circle back next quarter." The breakthrough came during what seemed like the worst possible moment. I was sitting in Linda's office on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and she looked absolutely exhausted. Her phone had been ringing non-stop. She had stacks of reports covering every inch of her desk, and I could tell she just wanted me gone. My instinct was to reschedule, be considerate, and come back when she wasn't so stressed. But then I remembered something my mentor had told me. Sometimes the best time to help someone is when they're drowning in problems. Instead of backing off, I leaned forward. "Linda," I said quietly, "you look like you're dealing with a crisis here. What if I told you our software could eliminate about 60% of those reports you're manually reviewing right now?" For the first time in 6 months, she stopped multitasking and looked directly at me. That's when I realized timing isn't about convenience, it's about relevance. Linda didn't need our software when everything was running smoothly. She needed it desperately when her world was falling apart. Within 15 minutes, she'd signed the contract, not because I'd gotten better at selling, but because I'd finally matched my solution to her actual moment of need. I started paying attention to timing everywhere after that. My colleague Jake always asked for raises in December when budgets were tight and everyone was stressed about year-end numbers. He got turned down 3 years running. Meanwhile, Sarah waited until April, right after our company announced record quarterly profits, and walked away with a promotion and a 12% salary bump. The pattern became obvious once I started looking for it. My friend Tom proposed to his girlfriend right after her grandmother died, thinking the romantic gesture would cheer her up. She said no, not because she didn't love him, but because she needed time to grieve. 6 months later, when she was in a better emotional space, he proposed again, and she said yes immediately. I watched my startup friends make the same timing mistakes over and over. Marcus launched his productivity app right when everyone was optimistic about returning to offices. 6 months too early. Emma waited until remote work was clearly permanent and launched a similar app to massive success. Same concept, completely different timing, totally different outcomes. The most brutal example was my old boss, Richard. He was a brilliant strategist but had zero sense of timing. He'd bring up controversial changes during crisis meetings, pitch new initiatives when the team was already overwhelmed, and schedule difficult conversations right before major deadlines. Great ideas, terrible execution, because timing was always wrong. What I learned is that our brains have natural energy cycles, and most people are completely unaware of them. Research shows that judges approve 73% more parole requests right after lunch compared to late morning sessions. Same judges, same cases, different timing, radically different outcomes. Most of life operates on these invisible rhythms that hardly anyone pays attention to. Now I watch for the signals. Is someone checking their phone constantly? Bad time for big requests. Did they just finish a successful project? Perfect moment to ask for more responsibility? Are they facing a deadline tomorrow? Worst possible time for a lengthy discussion about anything? But here's what's even more powerful than reading timing: learning how to create the conditions where timing works in your favor. Machiavelli understood that the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. I learned this principle the hard way when I tried to take on an entire department at once and nearly got myself fired. This happened during my time at a marketing agency in Chicago back in 2019. I was the new creative director, and I'd inherited a team that was let's call it dysfunctional. The copywriters hated the designers. The account managers blamed everyone for missed deadlines, and the whole department was basically at war with itself. My first instinct was to call a big meeting and address all the problems at once. You know, clear the air, get everything out in the open, make everyone shake hands and start fresh. It was a disaster. Instead of solving anything, I'd just given everyone a public forum to air their grievances against each other. The meeting turned into a 2-hour blame festival. Sarah from accounts accused the design team of never meeting deadlines. Mike from design fired back that the briefs were always unclear. The copywriters said nobody respected their input. And by the end, everyone was more frustrated than when we started. That's when my mentor Julia pulled me aside and said something that changed my entire approach. You're trying to boil the ocean, David. You can't fix a broken system by attacking it head-on. You need to understand the individual pieces first, then gradually reshape the dynamics. So I started having one-on-one coffee meetings instead. I discovered that Sarah wasn't actually difficult. She was just overwhelmed because she was covering for a colleague who'd quit 3 months earlier. Mike wasn't lazy with deadlines. He was just perfectionist who needed clearer priorities about which projects were actually urgent. The breakthrough came when I realized the copywriters and designers weren't really enemies. They were both frustrated with the same thing. Account management kept changing project requirements midstream without telling anyone. Instead of mediating between the creative teams, I helped them present a united front to accounts about establishing clearer project workflows. Within a month, I had individual allies throughout the department instead of one massive group of complainers. Sarah became my go-to person for realistic timeline planning. Mike started coming to me first when he had concerns about project scope. The copywriters appreciated that I was actually listening to their process suggestions. The most interesting part was watching how the dynamics shifted once I stopped treating everyone as the problem department. When people feel heard individually, they're way more willing to compromise on group issues. Sarah was much more flexible with deadlines once she knew I understood her workload challenges. I started recognizing this pattern everywhere. My friend Emma was trying to convince her entire extended family to change the location of their annual reunion. She kept sending group texts with logical arguments about cost and convenience, and everyone kept shooting her down. The family was united against change, but then Emma got smart. She started calling family members individually. She told her aunt about the better hotel amenities, mentioned to her uncle that the new location had his favorite golf course nearby, and emphasized to her cousins how much easier the travel would be with their young kids. By the time the next family group chat happened, 3 people independently suggested the new location. Emma never had to be the one pushing for change. She just created conditions where other people advocated for her idea. The family meeting that should have been a battle became a unanimous decision. The psychology behind this is fascinating. When people are part of a group, they feel pressure to maintain their public positions. But in private conversations, they're much more open to new information and perspective shifts. You're not asking them to admit they were wrong in front of everyone. You're just helping them see new angles. What I realized is that most conflicts aren't really about the surface issues people are arguing about. They're about feeling unheard, unappreciated, or misunderstood. Address those underlying concerns individually, and the group dynamics often resolve themselves naturally. But there's an even more powerful principle that works hand in hand with this approach, one that most people completely overlook because it seems counterintuitive. Machiavelli cautioned that it was never wise to show all your abilities completely. I discovered the truth of this during a job interview in Seattle that changed my entire career trajectory simply because I learned when to shut up. This was back in 2021. and I was interviewing for a senior marketing role at a tech company. The hiring manager, Jennifer, had a reputation for being tough to impress. I'd prepared for weeks, crafting perfect answers to every possible question, ready to showcase every accomplishment from the past 5 years. The interview started exactly as I'd expected. Jennifer asked about my background, my biggest achievements, my strategic thinking process. I launched into my well-rehearsed responses, hitting every bullet point. I'd memorized, but something felt off. She seemed distracted, polite, but not particularly engaged. Then she asked a question I hadn't prepared for. What's been your biggest failure in marketing? Instead of immediately jumping into damage control mode, I paused. Something told me to really think about this, not just give her the standard, "my weakness is actually a strength" nonsense. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably 10 seconds, I said, "You know what? I completely misjudged a product launch timing last year. Cost us about 40,000 in wasted ad spend." Then I stopped talking. No excuses, no elaborate explanation of how it wasn't really my fault. Jennifer leaned forward for the first time in the interview. "Tell me more about that," she said. So I did, but I kept my explanation short and focused. When I finished, I didn't try to fill the silence that followed. I just waited. That's when Jennifer started talking, really talking. She told me about a similar mistake she'd made early in her career, how it had taught her to trust data over instinct, and how she'd been looking for someone who understood that failure is part of growth, not something to hide behind corporate speak. The rest of the interview was completely different. Instead of me performing and her evaluating, we were actually having a conversation. She shared challenges the company was facing, asked for my genuine thoughts instead of rehearsed answers, and by the end, she was selling me on why I should want to work there. I got the job, and later, Jennifer told me that my willingness to be honest about failure and comfortable with silence had been the deciding factor. "Everyone else tried so hard to impress me," she said. "You were the only one who let me actually get to know you." This changed how I approached everything. In meetings, instead of being the first person to speak, I started listening to what everyone else revealed first. You'd be amazed how much people will tell you if you just wait. Colleagues would share their real concerns, their political positions, their personal motivations, all because I created space for them to fill. I watched my co-worker Marcus make the opposite mistake repeatedly. He'd walk into negotiations already talking, explain our entire strategy up front, and reveal our budget limitations before anyone asked. Meanwhile, I learned to ask questions and let the other party do most of the talking. 9 times out of 10, they'd tell me exactly what they needed to hear to close the deal. The most dramatic example was during a client pitch last spring. Our competitor's presentation went first, and they spent 45 minutes explaining every feature of their platform, their pricing structure, their implementation timeline, everything. When our turn came, I spent 5 minutes asking the client about their biggest pain points, then 20 minutes showing exactly how we solved those specific problems. We won the contract, and the client later told us it was because we were the only vendor who seemed to understand their actual needs, rather than just pushing our standard sales pitch. The competitor had revealed their entire playbook, while we learned exactly what buttons to push. What fascinates me is how silence makes people uncomfortable in predictable ways. Most humans will fill conversational gaps, often with information they hadn't planned to share. It's like our brains can't handle empty space in dialogue, so we automatically start providing context, explaining our positions, or revealing our real motivations. But here's the thing about silence. It's just one tool in a larger toolkit. Because sometimes the opposite approach is exactly what the situation demands. Sometimes appearing vulnerable can be your greatest strength, even when every instinct tells you to project power instead. Machiavelli advised that it is better to be feared than loved, but it is best of all not to show either the fear or the love that you inspire. I learned this lesson during the most humiliating meeting of my professional life, which turned into my biggest career breakthrough. This happened in 2020, when I was working for a consulting firm in Boston. My colleague Amanda had been gunning for the same promotion I wanted, and she'd been making my life miserable for months. She'd interrupt me in meetings, dismiss my ideas publicly, and basically treated me like I was incompetent. The situation came to a head during a client presentation where we were both supposed to present different sections. Amanda went first and absolutely crushed it. Confident, polished, commanding the room. When my turn came, she kept interrupting with corrections and clarifications that made me look unprepared and uncertain. I felt my face burning with embarrassment, but instead of fighting back or getting defensive, something made me just accept it. I said things like, "Amanda makes a good point, and I should have been clearer about that." The room was uncomfortable. I looked weak and I knew it. But here's what happened next. After the meeting, 3 different people pulled me aside privately. The client's VP said, "I appreciated how graciously you handled that situation." Our project manager mentioned that my willingness to collaborate made me seem like the easier person to work with. Even Amanda's boss made a comment about professional maturity under pressure. Within 2 weeks, I was asked to lead a high-profile project specifically because the client had requested me. They didn't want Amanda, despite her obvious competence, because she came across as difficult to work with. My apparent weakness had revealed her actual weakness. She couldn't control herself when she thought she had the upper hand. The promotion came 3 months later, and Amanda was furious. She complained to HR that I'd somehow manipulated the situation. But how do you complain about someone being too professional? Her aggressive approach had worked against weak opponents. But when I didn't give her the reaction she expected, her behavior looked petty and unprofessional to everyone watching. I started noticing this pattern everywhere. My friend Jake runs a small business, and he told me about dealing with an aggressive competitor who kept trying to poach his clients. Instead of fighting back directly, Jake started referring customers to this competitor when they weren't a good fit for his services anyway. The competitor got so confident that he started bad-mouthing Jake publicly, thinking he was winning. But Jake's clients noticed that he was secure enough to recommend alternatives when appropriate, while the competitor seemed desperate and unprofessional. Within 6 months, several clients had actually switched from the competitor back to Jake because they trusted his judgment more. The key insight is that appearing weak isn't the same as being weak. I wasn't actually intimidated by Amanda. I was strategically choosing not to engage in a power struggle that would make us both look bad. I let her reveal her character while maintaining my own professional reputation. This works because most people expect certain reactions to aggression. They're prepared for you to fight back, defend yourself, or get emotional. When you respond with unexpected grace, it throws them off balance and forces them to escalate inappropriately or back down entirely. Either way, you end up looking better than if you'd taken the bait. What I learned is that true strength often looks like restraint. Anyone can react emotionally or fight back when provoked. It takes real confidence to appear vulnerable while maintaining your actual position. People who fall for the appearance of weakness usually reveal their own insecurities in the process. But there's something even more powerful than appearing weak when others expect strength. It's about making yourself absolutely essential to the people who matter most, in ways they don't even realize until it's too late to replace you. Machiavelli observed that men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous. I discovered this harsh truth when I watched my most talented colleague get laid off while I kept my job during massive company cuts, simply because I'd made myself impossible to replace. This was during the pandemic in 2020, when I was working at a digital marketing agency in Phoenix. Our revenue dropped by 60% almost overnight, and management announced they'd have to let go of half the staff. Everyone was panicking, updating their resumes, and trying to prove their worth through overtime and flashy presentations. My colleague Ryan was honestly the best graphic designer I'd ever worked with. His creativity was off the charts, his technical skills were flawless, and clients constantly complimented his work. If you ranked everyone by pure talent, Ryan would have been in the top 3 people the company should keep. But Ryan made a critical mistake. He was replaceable. Meanwhile, I wasn't the most talented person on the team, but I'd spent 2 years quietly making myself essential in ways that weren't obvious to everyone else. I was the only person who understood our client billing system, which had been customized so extensively that even the software company couldn't help us troubleshoot it anymore. I'd also become the unofficial relationship manager for our 3 biggest clients. Not because anyone assigned me to do it, but because I'd noticed that our account managers kept leaving, and these clients were getting frustrated with constantly explaining their needs to new people. So I started being the consistent point of contact. The turning point came when our CEO, Mark, was preparing for the layoff announcements. He called me into his office and said, "I need you to walk me through the Morrison Industries account history before tomorrow's client call." Morrison was our biggest client, worth about $200,000 per year. That's when I realized Mark didn't actually understand the details of our most important relationships. He knew the revenue numbers, but he had no idea about the personal dynamics, the project preferences, or the communication styles that kept these clients happy. I did because I'd been paying attention while everyone else focused on their individual tasks. During the layoffs, Ryan was devastated. "I don't understand," he told me. "My portfolio is stronger than anyone's. How does this make business sense?" And he was right about his talent. But talent without strategic positioning is just expensive overhead when companies need to cut costs. I felt terrible about Ryan's situation, but it taught me something crucial about how organizations really work. When times get tough, companies don't keep their most talented people. They keep their most essential people. And being essential isn't about being the best at one thing, it's about being the only person who can handle specific, critical functions. After that experience, I started deliberately identifying gaps in our operations that no one else wanted to deal with. I learned the compliance requirements that everyone found boring. I became the person who could handle our most difficult client, who nobody else had patience for. I documented processes, but kept the most crucial details in my head. Was this manipulative? Maybe. But I'd watched too many good people get blindsided by layoffs because they assumed talent would protect them. The harsh reality is that in business, loyalty goes both ways only when you're holding cards that matter. Make yourself disposable, and you will be disposed of when it's convenient. I started noticing this pattern everywhere once I knew what to look for. My friend Sarah survived 3 rounds of layoffs at her tech company because she was the only person who understood their legacy database system. Nobody wanted to learn it because it was old and clunky, but it ran half their operations. The most interesting example was my neighbor Tom, who worked as a maintenance supervisor at a large office complex. When the building was sold to new owners, everyone expected management changes. But Tom had spent years building relationships with all the major tenants, and he was the only person they trusted to access their spaces for repairs and upgrades. What I learned is that true job security doesn't come from being excellent at what everyone can see. It comes from being the only solution to problems that matter. But here's what's even more powerful than making yourself indispensable to one organization. Learning to control the story everyone tells about what's happening around them. Machiavelli knew that victory is not always to the strongest, but frequently to the most cunning. I learned this when I watched a co-worker completely rewrite history about a project disaster and somehow end up getting promoted while the rest of us took the blame. This happened in 2019 when I was working for a consulting firm in Atlanta. Our team had been working on a major client implementation for 8 months, and it was an absolute train wreck. The project was 6 weeks behind schedule, 30% over budget, and the client was furious about missed deadlines and scope creep. The project manager was supposed to be Lisa, but she'd been overwhelmed from day one and basically checked out mentally around month 4. The rest of us had been scrambling to cover for her, working weekends, firefighting problems that should have been prevented with proper planning. Everyone knew Lisa had dropped the ball. When the client finally called for an emergency meeting to discuss the project failures, I expected Lisa to own up to her mistakes. Instead, she walked into that conference room with a completely different version of events. According to her narrative, this hadn't been a failure at all. It had been an agile response to evolving client needs. Lisa painted the delays as strategic pivots based on enhanced client feedback. The budget overruns became investments in superior deliverables that exceeded original specifications. She positioned herself as the hero who had navigated complex stakeholder dynamics while keeping the project from complete disaster. The most incredible part was watching how the room responded to her presentation. The client, who had been furious and an hour earlier, started nodding along. Our senior partners, who knew the real story, began framing their questions around Lisa's version of events. Within 90 minutes, perception had completely shifted. I sat there in shock as Lisa received praise for her crisis management skills and client-focused leadership approach. The same executives who should have fired her were now discussing how her experience managing difficult implementations made her perfect for a senior role on future, challenging projects. That's when I realized I'd been playing a completely different game than Lisa. I'd been focused on the actual facts, timelines, deliverables, budget numbers. Lisa had been focused on the story those facts told, and she'd written herself as the protagonist instead of the villain. After that meeting, I started paying attention to how narratives form in business settings. The person who speaks first about what happened usually gets to define the framework for how everyone else interprets events. If you let someone else control the initial story, you're stuck responding to their version of reality instead of presenting your own. I watched this play out again 6 months later when our marketing campaign for a tech startup completely flopped. The ads got terrible engagement, conversions were basically zero, and we'd burned through their entire quarterly budget with nothing to show for it. But our account director Marcus was ready, before anyone could start. Pointing fingers, Marcus scheduled a debrief meeting where he framed the campaign as valuable market research that revealed critical insights about customer behavior. He positioned the low engagement as important data about audience segmentation and the poor conversions as strategic learnings about message positioning. By the time Marcus finished his presentation, the client was actually thanking us for the comprehensive market analysis and asking us to apply these insights to their next campaign with an increased budget. Same facts, completely different narrative, totally different outcome. What fascinates me is how eager people are to accept a coherent story, even when they witness the actual events themselves. Our brains prefer narrative frameworks that make sense over messy realities that don't fit clean explanations. Whoever provides that framework first usually wins the perception battle. I realized that in business, politics, relationships, everywhere really, there are always multiple ways to interpret what happened. The person who gets to tell the story first and tells it most convincingly essentially gets to write history. Facts matter less than the framework you use to organize those facts into meaning. But controlling narratives is just the beginning, because once you understand how to shape perception, you discover there's an even more powerful dynamic at play, one that involves giving people exactly what they think they want to fight against. Machiavelli warned that a prince should never lack enemies, for in war he becomes known. I discovered the truth of this when my startup team was falling apart from internal conflicts, until I helped them find something they could all hate together. This was back in 2021, when I was consulting for a small fintech company in Austin called StreamPay. The founders, Alex and Jordan, had been best friends in college, but running a business together was destroying their relationship. They disagreed on everything: product features, hiring decisions, marketing strategy, even office temperature. The tension was spreading to their 8-person team. People were taking sides, productivity was tanking, and I could see the company was maybe 2 months away from completely imploding. Traditional team-building exercises weren't working because the fundamental problem wasn't lack of communication. It was too many competing visions with no unifying force. During one particularly brutal meeting where Alex and Jordan were arguing about whether to focus on small businesses or enterprise clients, I noticed something interesting. The only time they stopped fighting each other was when Jordan mentioned how their biggest competitor, Payflow, had just landed a major client they'd been pursuing for months. That's when I realized what was missing. StreamPay didn't have a common enemy. Alex was focused on internal perfectionism, Jordan was worried about feature comparisons, and the team was caught between their different priorities. But Payflow, everyone hated Payflow. I started steering conversations toward competitive intelligence. Instead of asking, what features should we build next? I'd ask, what's Payflow doing that we can do better? Instead of debating target markets, we analyzed which customers Payflow was neglecting. Suddenly, Alex and Jordan were collaborating instead of competing. The transformation was remarkable. Alex's perfectionist tendencies became valuable when framed as, we need to be flawless because Payflow's reputation for bugs gives us an advantage. Jordan's aggressive growth mindset made sense as, we have to move fast before Payflow copies our innovations. Within 6 weeks, the team was more unified than it had been since the company started. They developed an entire culture around being the anti-Payflow, more responsive customer service, cleaner user interface, more transparent pricing. The external focus had channeled all their competitive energy outward instead of inward. The most interesting part was watching how this affected their marketing and sales efforts. Instead of generic messaging about their features, StreamPay started positioning themselves specifically against Payflow's weaknesses. Their sales presentations became, here's what Payflow can't do for you, rather than here's what we can do. This strategy worked so well that I started recognizing the pattern everywhere. My friend Rachel runs a small marketing agency, and her team was constantly bickering about creative direction until they landed a client who was switching from a notoriously difficult competitor. Suddenly, everyone was united around showing them how marketing should really be done. I noticed the same dynamic in my neighborhood association. People couldn't agree on budget priorities until the city announced plans for a highway expansion that would affect property values. Suddenly, homeowners who'd been arguing about landscaping budgets were working together on legal challenges and political lobbying. The psychology behind this is fascinating. Humans evolved in tribal environments where external threats were essential for group cohesion. We're literally wired to bond more strongly with our in-group when there's a clear out-group to unite against. Remove the external threat, and we start creating internal conflicts to satisfy that evolutionary programming. What I learned is that successful leaders don't eliminate conflict. They redirect it. Instead of having team members compete with each other, give them something external to compete against. It could be a competitor, an industry standard, a regulatory challenge, or even just an ambitious timeline that everyone has to rally around. But there's something even more powerful than uniting people against a common enemy. It's about understanding when strategic generosity can completely reshape how people see you, especially when that generosity comes at exactly the moment they need it most. Machiavelli observed that benefits should be given little by little so that they may be better enjoyed. I learned the truth of this when I watched my colleague completely transform his reputation with one perfectly timed act of generosity, while I'd been helping people for months with zero recognition. This happened in 2020 when I was working at a software company in Denver during the early pandemic chaos. Everyone was stressed about layoffs, working from home challenges, and managing clients who were cutting budgets left and right. I'd been the guy who always helped out, covering shifts, sharing resources, mentoring new hires. My colleague Derek, on the other hand, was pretty much focused on his own work. Not unfriendly, but definitely not the person you'd call if you needed a favor. He was competent at his job, but not particularly generous with his time or knowledge. Most people saw him as reliable, but not especially caring about the team. The situation changed during our biggest crisis of the year. Our main client was threatening to cancel a $200,000 contract because their project manager had quit suddenly, and we were scrambling to salvage the relationship. Everyone was panicking, working 18-hour days, and our project lead Sarah was basically having a breakdown. I'd been helping Sarah for weeks, taking on extra tasks, staying late to review her work, even covering some client calls when she was overwhelmed. But here's what I didn't understand about timing. My help was expected by that point. I'd established myself as the reliable backup, so my assistance felt normal rather than exceptional. Derek watched this crisis unfold for about a week without offering much help. Then, right when Sarah was at her absolute lowest point, he made his move. He volunteered to take over the entire client relationship, told Sarah to take the weekend off to recover, and spent his Saturday personally calling the client to rebuild trust. The client was so impressed that someone senior was giving them personal attention during a weekend that they not only kept the contract but expanded it. Sarah was grateful beyond words, and our boss was amazed that Derek had stepped up during the crisis when we needed leadership most. Within a month, Derek was promoted to Senior Account Manager. Sarah nominated him for the company's Quarterly Excellence Award. The client specifically requested him for future projects. Meanwhile, all my weeks of steady help were forgotten because they hadn't happened at a moment of peak desperation. That's when I realized the psychology behind strategic generosity. Our brains remember experiences based on peak moments and how things ended, not the cumulative total of positive interactions. Derek's single weekend intervention created a more powerful memory than my months of consistent support, because it came at exactly the right emotional moment. I started noticing this pattern everywhere. My friend Lisa had been casually dating someone for 3 months, doing nice things regularly, but getting lukewarm responses. Then his father had a heart attack, and Lisa dropped everything to drive him to the hospital and stay with him all night. That crisis moment created more relationship bonding than 3 months of normal dating. The most interesting example was watching how our CEO handled employee recognition. Instead of giving praise consistently throughout the year, he'd wait for moments when people were feeling underappreciated or facing difficult challenges. Then, his recognition felt like rescue rather than routine feedback. I learned that timing multiplies the impact of generosity exponentially. Help someone when they're comfortable and it's nice but forgettable. Help them when they're drowning and you become their hero. The same action, completely different emotional weight, totally different long-term gratitude. What fascinates me about this principle is how it reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. We don't actually value consistent kindness as much as dramatic intervention. We're wired to remember people who save us from specific moments of crisis more than those who prevent crises through steady support. But there's an even more sophisticated strategy than timing your generosity perfectly. It's about ensuring you always have multiple paths forward, so you're never completely dependent on any single relationship, opportunity, or outcome to determine your success. Machiavelli counseled that one should wish to have all men as friends, but when this is not possible, one should at least try not to. Have them as enemies. I learned this lesson when I watched my most successful mentor navigate a corporate restructuring by having backup plans that no one else even knew existed. This was back in 2019, when I was working at a consulting firm in Chicago. My mentor, Patricia, was a senior director who seemed to have everything figured out. She'd been with the company for 8 years, had strong relationships with all the partners, and was widely expected to make partner herself within the next 2 years. Then our parent company announced they were merging us with a competitor. Everyone knew this meant massive layoffs, redundant positions eliminated, and a completely new power structure. Most people, including me, went into panic mode. We started working crazy hours, trying to make ourselves indispensable, and basically betting everything on staying valuable to the new organization. Patricia's response was completely different. She didn't seem worried at all, which confused me because she had just as much to lose as anyone. When I asked her about it over coffee, she just smiled and said, "I learned a long time ago never to depend on any single institution for my security." Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things about Patricia that I'd never paid attention to before. She was on the advisory board of 2 startup companies. She regularly spoke at industry conferences and had built a personal brand beyond our company. She maintained relationships with executive recruiters and former colleagues who'd moved to other firms. Most interestingly, Patricia had been quietly developing expertise in areas that weren't central to her current role. She'd gotten certified in digital transformation consulting, learned data analytics tools, and even taken some courses in cybersecurity. None of this was required for her job, but she'd been building these skills for years. When the merger announcement came, Patricia already had 3 different exit strategies in motion. One of the advisory board companies had offered her a VP role. A former colleague wanted her to join his new consultancy as a founding partner, and she'd been in preliminary conversations with a major client about creating an independent consulting arrangement. The most impressive part was that Patricia used these options as leverage rather than escape routes. When the new management team approached her about staying on in a reduced role with a 20% salary cut, she was able to negotiate from a position of strength. She ended up keeping her current title and salary because they knew she had alternatives. Meanwhile, I watched colleagues who'd put all their energy into protecting their current positions get systematically eliminated or demoted. They had no leverage because everyone knew they had nowhere else to go. Their desperation made them accept whatever terms were offered, no matter how unfavorable. The lesson hit me hard when my friend Marcus got laid off from his marketing director position after 12 years with the same company. He'd been completely loyal, never even updated his LinkedIn profile, and had 0 connections outside his current workplace. At 43, he was starting his job search from scratch with no network and skills that were specific to one industry. Compare that to my colleague Sarah, who'd always maintained relationships with former co-workers, regularly attended industry meetups, and had been developing skills in adjacent areas. When her position was eliminated, she had a new job lined up within 3 weeks because people knew her value and trusted her abilities. What I realized is that loyalty should always be mutual. Companies will eliminate your position without hesitation when it serves their interests, but they expect you to be completely committed to them. That's not a fair exchange, and smart professionals understand that diversification isn't betrayal. It's basic career insurance. I started building my own option portfolio after watching Patricia navigate the merger so successfully. I began writing industry articles, speaking at local events, and maintaining relationships with people outside my immediate company. Not because I was planning to leave, but because I wanted the security that comes from having choices. But having multiple options is just the foundation. Because once you've built that security, you discover there's an even more powerful principle about using time itself as your ultimate competitive advantage, especially when everyone else is focused on immediate results. Machiavelli advised that one must imitate both the fox and the lion. The lion cannot defend himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. I discovered the power of strategic patience when I watched my impulsive colleague destroy $1 million deal while I secured an even bigger contract by doing absolutely nothing for 6 months. This happened in 2021 when I was working business development for a SaaS company in Portland. We'd been competing against our main rival, TechFlow, for a massive enterprise client called Morrison Manufacturing. The contract was worth about $1.2 million over 3 years, and both companies had been pitching hard for 8 months. My colleague Jake was leading our sales effort, and he was getting increasingly frustrated with Morrison's slow decision-making process. Every week, their procurement team would ask for more documentation, additional references, or modifications to our proposal. Jake kept pushing for closure, sending follow-up emails daily and scheduling calls to move things forward. Meanwhile, TechFlow's sales rep was doing exactly the same thing. Both companies were treating this like a sprint, trying to pressure Morrison into making a quick decision. The client was getting overwhelmed with aggressive sales tactics from both sides, and I could see them starting to pull back from the entire evaluation process. That's when I suggested a completely different approach to Jake. Instead of pushing harder, what if we gave Morrison space to breathe? What if we positioned ourselves as the patient, consultative partner rather than another pushy vendor? Jake thought I was crazy. If we back off now, TechFlow will swoop in and steal the deal. But I'd noticed something interesting about Morrison's decision-making culture. Their CEO, Robert Chen, had mentioned in casual conversation that they'd been burned by rushed technology decisions in the past. Their current ERP system had been selected under pressure from a pushy vendor, and it had caused major integration problems that took 2 years to resolve. So instead of competing on urgency, I started competing on patience. When Morrison asked for time to review our latest proposal, I said, "Take all the time you need. A decision this important deserves careful consideration." When they postponed meetings, I responded with understanding rather than frustration. I became the vendor who wasn't adding pressure to their process. The turning point came 4 months later when Morrison's CTO called me directly. "I have to tell you," he said, "your competitor has been calling us twice a week, asking for status updates. It's starting to feel desperate. Meanwhile, you've been available when we need you, but never pushy. That tells us something about how you'll treat us as a long-term partner." Jake was furious when Morrison chose TechFlow initially, but here's the interesting part. 6 months later, Morrison fired TechFlow because their implementation was rushed and poorly executed. Apparently, TechFlow's aggressive sales approach had carried over into their project management style, and they'd pushed Morrison to go live before the system was ready. When Morrison called me back to discuss alternatives, I didn't gloat or mention TechFlow's failure. I just said, "We're here when you're ready to have that conversation." By then, their trust in my patient approach was so strong that we skipped the entire competitive bidding process. They offered us a $1.8 million contract directly. What I learned is that in business, most people are optimizing for quarterly results, while the biggest opportunities require yearly thinking. Everyone else was fighting for immediate victories while I was building long-term credibility. Time became my competitive advantage because so few people have the discipline to use it strategically. I started recognizing this pattern everywhere. My friend David kept pressuring his girlfriend about marriage until she broke up with him for being pushy. Meanwhile, his brother Tom waited patiently for his partner to bring up the topic naturally, and they got engaged 6 months later. Same desire, completely different time horizons, opposite outcomes. The psychology behind this is fascinating. Our brains evolved to respond to immediate threats, but modern success often requires resisting those primitive instincts. Using time as a weapon means fighting against 100,000 years of evolution that tell us to act quickly or lose. Opportunities. That's exactly why it works. Most people can't do it, but strategic patience is just one element of a larger principle. Because once you understand how to use time effectively, you realize there's something even more important than being patient with opportunities. It's building systems and relationships that will outlast your personal involvement and continue creating value long after you're gone. Machiavelli observed that since men walk almost always in paths beaten by others and follow by imitation their deeds, a prudent man ought always to follow in the footsteps of great men. I learned this final lesson when I watched my former boss get erased from company history, while my seemingly less important mentor's influence still shapes decisions 5 years after she left. This happened when I was working at a digital marketing agency in Miami back in 2018. My boss, Richard, was undeniably brilliant. He had an MBA from Wharton, closed the biggest deals, and was constantly featured in industry publications. Everyone knew Richard was the star of our company, and he made sure they remembered it. Meanwhile, my mentor Carol worked in operations, a role most people considered unglamorous. She wasn't quotable in industry magazines, didn't speak at conferences, and rarely got credit for the company's successes. But Carol did something that Richard never thought to do. She built systems that could function without her. Richard's approach was to be the irreplaceable genius at the center of every important decision. Client presentations, strategic planning, major negotiations, everything went through him. He believed his personal brilliance was the company's greatest asset, and he was probably right. But he made a fatal mistake by making that brilliance non-transferable. Carol, on the other hand, spent years documenting processes, training junior staff, and creating frameworks that anyone could follow. She developed our client onboarding system, standardized our project management approach, and built reporting templates that made complex data analysis accessible to everyone on the team. When Richard left for a better opportunity in 2019, the company struggled for months. Clients started complaining about inconsistent service. Deals fell through because no one understood his negotiation strategies, and the leadership team scrambled to replace knowledge that had never been and properly captured. But when Carol retired 6 months later, the transition was seamless. Her systems kept running automatically. New employees could get up to speed quickly using her training materials. Project timelines stayed consistent because her frameworks were embedded in how we operated. The company barely missed a beat. Here's the fascinating part. 3 years later, Richard's name rarely comes up in conversations at the old company. His achievements are remembered as company wins, but his personal contribution has faded from collective memory. Meanwhile, Carol's influence is everywhere. Every new hire learns the Carol method for client management. Her decision-making frameworks are still used in weekly meetings. This taught me something profound about legacy. Richard built his reputation around being indispensable, but that made his impact completely dependent on his physical presence. Carol built systems that made her wisdom available even when she wasn't in the room. Richard's legacy died when he left. Carroll's legacy became institutional knowledge. I started noticing this pattern in other successful organizations. Steve Jobs gets all the credit for Apple's success, but the company's continued innovation after his death proves that he'd built systems and culture that could function without him. His real genius wasn't individual brilliance, it was creating sustainable excellence. Compare that to companies built around charismatic founders who never developed strong operational systems. When those leaders leave or die, the organizations often collapse because all the critical knowledge was locked inside one person's head. Personal genius without systemic thinking creates fragile success. I began applying this principle to my own career development. Instead of hoarding knowledge to make myself indispensable, I started documenting my best practices, training colleagues, and creating processes that could outlive my involvement with specific projects. Counterintuitively, this made me more valuable, not less. The most powerful realization was understanding that true influence comes from multiplication, not just personal achievement. Carroll influenced dozens of employees who learned her methods and carried them to other companies. Her impact rippled through an entire industry because she'd invested in transferable systems rather than personal celebrity. What Machiavelli understood and what Carroll demonstrated is that the greatest leaders don't just achieve results. They create conditions where excellent results become inevitable, even without their direct involvement. They build roads that others can travel long after the original architect is gone. That's how you transform temporary success into lasting influence. So here's my challenge to you. Look at your current role, your relationships, your projects, and ask yourself this question. If you disappeared tomorrow, what would continue functioning because of the systems you built, and what would collapse because it depended entirely on your personal presence? The answer tells you whether you're building legacy or just building ego. Choose wisely.